Good morning, class. I'm here today to talk about Module 7. I brought a little audience, which is next to me, so I'm not having to talk to myself in these recordings. So let's, without further ado, get started. So today I'm talking about Module 7, which are the cognitive models. And so we'll address what is cognition and cognitive. If you're not sure what that word means, that's okay. Okay, Module 7 objectives are to compare and contrast behaviorism learning theory, which we talked about in Module 6, and social learning theory, which is another offshoot of learning theory. And we'll explain and apply the main tenets of social learning theory, which is self-regulation, modeling, and self-efficacy. And then we'll discuss how and why outcome expectancies are central concepts in substance use. And then we'll apply social learning theory to relapse prevention. So in this video, we will do modules 1 and 2. In the next video, we'll do modules 3 and 4. Objectives 1 and 2. So for objective 1, we'll compare and contrast behaviorism learning theory and social learning theory. Well, as you remember, behaviorism learning theory from the last chapter is the idea that learning is shaped largely through consequence. So you behave, and then there's a consequence for your behavior. And the consequences being reinforcement or punishment. Reinforcement increases the behavior, punishment decreases the behavior. So we'll contrast that with what we call social learning theory, which recognizes another concept, which is called cognition. So first, let's look at what is cognition. Cognition is mental processes that include things like thinking and self-talk, self-efficacy, what we'll call self-regulation, expectancies, what do you believe will happen? So when Pavlov paired the food and the bell, all that they really recognized was salivation to the bell or salivation to the food, because Pavlov was under the influence of behaviorism, meaning they just didn't pay any attention to cognition at all. But when the dog started salivating to the bell, we can guess that because bell was paired with food, that the dog came to expect the food when the bell rang, right? So early behaviorism learning theory had completely ignored this. So along comes a guy by the name of Albert Bandura, and he changed all this. He liked behaviorism, but he thought there was one component that was really missing, and therefore he kind of rejected the notion of behaviorism, or at least built onto it. So here we can introduce cognitive theory, and out of that, this cognitive behavioral framework, which combines cognitive with behavioral. So the stuff we talked about before, behaviorism, you behave and then there's a reinforcement or a consequence, but we're going to add on to that this cognitive component. So what is the cognitive component? It's the idea that mental processes like expectations, like self-efficacy, like what the self-talk that goes on in our head actually influences our behavior, in addition to the kinds of things in the environment like reinforcement or punishment. And the cognitive behavioral framework that comes out of that, and you might have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, or CBT, it integrates cognitions and behaviors to explain addictive behavior. So CBT is a type of therapy that's very, very popular in addiction treatment. And it really, takes that cognitive component and applies that along with the kinds of concepts we talked about in Module 6. Okay, so this guy comes along named Albert Bandura, and he forms what is called social learning theory, or sometimes called social cognitive theory. And he thought that basically behaviors theory was too mechanistic. He said that, a consequence does not automatically influence a behavior. So for example, if you are reinforced for a behavior, it's not that automatic that will increase the behavior. Instead, there are other things that are going on. And as I mentioned before, one of them is cognition. But he created a model that he called reciprocal determinism. And that's that there are person variables like cognitions, expectancies, for example, environmental variables like this, particularly he thought was important, the social environment, and behavior, which would be like social media use or drug use. And those three things are constantly interacting. So let's take a look at how those would interact in the case of addiction. So again, you have these personal factors, environmental factors, and behavioral factors, and we've got those on the left there. And so let's look at how those work together. So a personal characteristic might be, for example, genetics, right? That make you more susceptible to using drugs or alcohol, let's say. It could be things, like a comorbid condition like depression or anxiety, cognitive appraisal, stress that you're under, things like that. Now that may lead you to use drugs, okay? So you may get some drugs, find some drugs, right? And then that now, see the double arrow, that can change your personal characteristics. Now the drugs are affecting your brain and that changes you from within. So there's a double arrow there. Let's take a look at personal characteristics and the social environment. So by genetics, let's say you're more susceptible to using drugs. Well, that is going to lead you to maybe seek out people who use drugs, right? And then from those people, you get some social reinforcement, you become friends, they support your use of drugs. And again, then that changes you into, for example, having more positive expectancies of drug use. So we see that interplay back and forth there. Let's take a look at the social environment and drug use. Let's say you're hanging around with people who use drugs. Well, then drugs basically are more available to you. And so you're more likely to use drugs. But as you use more drugs, then you're more likely to meet people who use drugs. And again, that's feeding into the personal characteristics. So there's this complex web of things. There's the behavior, there's the personal factors, and then there's the environmental factors. And those are constantly fluctuating and changing and moving along together. One may be dominant at a particular time, but all are working together to promote addiction or to promote abstinence, right? Because we can also use them for good. So really, when we talk about treatment for drug use or drug addiction, the treatment can focus on those personal factors. For example, reducing childhood trauma, treating comorbid conditions, reducing stress and things like that. It can also focus on the behavior, the drug use. It can also focus on the environment. So all of these things are working together. So let's get into objective 2, explain and apply the main tenets of social learning theory. We're going to talk about self-regulation, modeling, and self-efficacy. These are 3 important concepts of SLT, or social learning theory. Self-regulation is one of those person variables or personal factors, and we'll talk about what that is. Modeling is an environmental factor. We'll talk about what that is. And then self-efficacy is also a personal factor. And we'll talk about how these affect drug use. Okay, first, self-regulation. We regulate our own behavior cognitively from within via using these internal standards and self-reinforcement and punishment. So you may think to yourself, if you are the type of student that I was, that somehow I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough unless I get a certain amount of schoolwork done. per day, right? So I have this internal standard, and sometimes that internal standard can be like a little bit extreme, like I have to do this and this and this and this, or I'm not going to be good enough, or somehow I'm not going to be enough. Sometimes it's hard to ever get to the point of being enough. Another thing that I can do is that I can set my own reinforcements and punishments in my own head. If I get a certain amount of schoolwork done today, I may congratulate myself and say, wow, you did good. Now you're a good person, or something like that. Or I can say, if I get a certain amount of schoolwork done today, I can smoke weed and play video games. So as I was mentioning, sometimes these performance standards are too extreme, and substances are used to cope in that way. But at any rate, what this says is that self-regulation is one of those person variables, and it is the idea is that the environment, or the consequences, the outward world is not in total control of behavior. Some of the internal stuff controls behavior as well. So again, that departure from traditional behaviorist learning theory. Okay, another departure from traditional behaviorist learning theory is modeling. And modeling is learning by observing other people. So we can just simply watch someone do drugs, or, you say, well, I didn't watch my parents do drugs, but I did, in particular, watch my parents drink alcohol every single night that I was growing up. They always had at least a drink. My father oftentimes had many more, but my mother always had one drink every night. And it would be a certain time a day. She would have her little cocktail hour where she would have a brandy and vermouth, which, if you've ever tasted it, is quite disgusting. The modeling effects are that, you learn new skills. One is that, you have observational learning effects. You just learn new skills. I learned how to make a brandy vermouth. I oddly know how to make that. I know how to, how also that she would sip it and things like that. So I learned those things. I learned about alcohol use. I learned new skills even before I had ever done alcohol myself. So this is learning just from that observation. There's also inhibitory and disinhibitory effect, and that has to do with whether the model gets rewarded or punished, reinforced or punished. So my mother generally would relax as soon as she would have her one drink of the night, and she would become conversational and things like that. So I could see that would relieve her stress, right? And so that would have a disinhibitory effect on me, meaning that I would be more likely to use alcohol because I see that it was good for her. It had a relaxing outcome for her. There's also response facilitation effects, and those are like social facilitation that you might have learned, for example, about in introductory psychology, where if you go running with another person, you tend to run harder, run faster because of the presence of that other person. It's true for clapping. Once one person starts clapping, everybody else starts clapping, right? So there's this social facilitation effect. This is something that we already do, right? We already clap, so we're not learning how to clap, but the presence of other people is making us do it harder. Well, experimental evidence shows that, in fact, that response facilitation effect of drinking is pretty strong. So what they do is they take people into the lab and they put them with what we call a confederate, or kind of a fake person who's acting in a certain way. Not a fake person, a real person, but they're acting. And what they do is they have one person, they'll put them with somebody who's drinking very heavily versus someone who's drinking very light, someone who's drinking very fast versus someone who's drinking very slow. And it turns out that participants in the experiment will match the drinking behavior of whoever the confederate is. Whether if they're drinking heavy, then the person will tend to drink heavier. And you may notice that with your friends. If you hang out with heavy drinkers or heavy smokers, you tend to do more. So there's definitely good evidence showing that modeling effect when it comes to alcohol, particularly with response to particularly with a reference to social facilitation or response facilitation. Okay, second concept, self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a belief or a doubt, in the case of low self-efficacy, in your capability of doing something. Do you believe that you can do something? Do you believe that, for example, you can quit alcohol? And we'll talk about that. But there are a number of self-efficacy effects when it comes to drug use. Okay, so where does self-efficacy come from? Now, right now, I'm going to be dealing with the left side of this slide first. Where do we get self-efficacy? Well, self-efficacy comes from accomplishments, so past failures and successes. So, for example, if you tried to stop smoking and you tried several times, but you always went back to smoking, that sense of I can't do it, I just can't stop smoking, is coming from that repeated failure. If you stop smoking and you're successful at it, then there's this idea of I can do it, right? So if you may have so we build self-efficacy from accomplishments. You may have gone into college or gone into a particular class saying, oh, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can take this class. I don't think I can learn this. I don't think I can take an online class or something like that. And then, you get an A on something or you do well. And little by little, you build up that self-efficacy. And now you're like, yeah, I can do this, right? So those accomplishments, it turns out, are super, super, super important toward building self-efficacy. Vicarious experiences, seeing other people's success and failure. So when we see somebody else, for example, who quits, that is really helpful, for example, for quitting yourself, because you're building self-efficacy by watching someone else. Now, this is not as good as accomplishment. Accomplishment, bar none, is your best way of building self-efficacy. Social persuasion is hearing things like you can do it, so you're trying to, let's say, quit smoking, and somebody says you can do it, you can do it. You got your little cheering section of your mom and dad or whatever, and that helps somewhat, but it's not a great source of self-efficacy. Again, accomplishments, mastery is going to be your number one source. And then finally, emotional arousal is an issue, because if you get too worked up, if you get too much stress, too much arousal, then you're going to be likely to not have very good self-efficacy. So, for example, if you're going to play a basketball game, let's say, if you get a lot of arousal, I'm freaking out, I'm going to lose this game, then you're unlikely to think that you can do it. It gets in the way of performance. Okay, so let's look at how the implications are for treatment of substance use disorder. If we want to increase self-efficacy, we've got to do certain things to do so. We'll talk about how increasing self-efficacy actually is good treatment for substance use disorder. Okay, so for one, accomplishments, we don't want to start with like, okay, you're going to quit and completely never ever use again, and you're gonna lose weight, and you're gonna get off of cigarettes, and you're gonna get A's in school. So all of that's just like too much. You want to start with small tasks that you can actually do, and that is going to be related to your ability to cope, the skills that you build. We build up from small tasks. In terms of vicarious experiences, being around people who are in recovery and doing well, that's good, right? Because we see their successes. And if we can witness that's good. Again, the cheering section, it could be helpful. It's certainly not going to hurt, but it's a pretty weak effect, with accomplishments being number one for sure. And then finally, teaching people how to cope with these emotions, a strong anxiety, is also really helpful to building that self-efficacy. Okay, well, there are lots of types of self-efficacy when it comes to substance use. One is resistant self-efficacy, and that is just avoiding substance use in the first place, not doing it in the first place, not ever trying cocaine or whatever. And then there's harm reduction substance use, which is where you for example, decide to drink alcohol, but avoid harm after that, avoid harm while using alcohol. So, for example, don't drink and drive and stuff like that. What's your ability? What is your self-efficacy that says, I know I can do that. I can drink alcohol, but it's not going to affect my schoolwork. It's not going to affect legal issues with regard to DUIs and things like that. Action self-efficacy is achieving abstinence or controlled use, being able to get there. Abstinence and coping self-efficacy, staying off of drugs, your ability to say, I can do it. I can stay off of drugs. I can cope with relapse. If I go back on, I'm going to be able to do this. I'm going to be able to get off again. Recovery, self-efficacy, returning to recovery after lapses, after relapses, and we'll talk about what a lapse is in the next set of objectives. Okay, so self-efficacy and substance use, as I talked about before or mentioned, what does the research say? Abstinence self-efficacy will affect the first time to drink, the amount of time that a person will drink. So the more that you feel like you can do it, there's a fly in here. The more that you feel like you can stay off of alcohol, the better, the more capable you feel, the better you are at actually staying off of it. Self-efficacy, though, fluctuates. It goes up and down. So at a moment, you may feel really strong, and at other times, you feel not so strong. And that's what the research from Sean Clemente says. Another set of research was a smoking cessation intervention. They were trying to get people to stop smoking. They gave them cognitive behavioral therapy, which, remember, deals with the cognitions as well as the behaviors. And they found that people increased their abstinence self-efficacy, meaning that they started to believe, I can do this, I can get off. And that increased self-efficacy led to decreased smoking. Those who increased their self-efficacy actually decreased smoking. And so increasing self-efficacy can be helpful. And it is a good way of dealing with one of those person variables in treatment. Okay, well, next time we will talk about objective 3. I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and we'll see you next time.